Welcome to the fourth and final installment of our series on the origin and development of the Southern Midlands, Southern Appalachian, or Scotch-Irish dialect. David Hackett Fischer claims that scholars generally agree that this language developed from the Northern or Northumbrian dialect of English that was spoken in the Lowlands of Scotland, in the north of Ireland, and the border counties of England during the 17th and early 18th centuries. Because of the presence of isolated communities in the Southern Appalachia and the Ozarks, many of the northern British speechways still echo and sometimes reverberate in the region's steep hollers. Overall, though, the dialect has changed some over the years, and not always in metropolitan areas where universities and diversified employment opportunities existed. For instance, interactions with English, Germanic, French, and Welsh settlers in Ulster didn't end on the eastern shores of the Atlantic. Intermarriages and socialization among their participants or their residents continued in the backcountry of central Appalachia and southern Appalachia, so we must remember that most of those folk were poor. They headed to the backcountry where they could find some cheap land on which to live as farmers and hunters. New words and perhaps sounds of Native Americans were likewise added to the dialect. For example, they also incorporated some German words like hex, as in cast a spell, and sauerkraut. Settlers in the New World didn't have words for things like squash, canoe, moccasin, moose, chipmunk, or raccoon, so they borrowed those names from the indigenous Americans, and no doubt probably some effects on their voice too, their sound. Still, the basic language structure and content derives from the Northumbrian and Scots dialects. As the early pioneers settled across the upland south, they left their mark on the landscape by naming counties and towns after their people or the places where they had lived. The following place names bear some witness to their presence and the resilience of their language and word choices. Dixon City, Edinburgh, and Tyrone, Pennsylvania; Sterling, Stewart's Draft, and McLean, Virginia; Rogersville, Johnson City, and Knoxville, Tennessee; and Graham, McDowell, and Scotland counties in North Carolina. Mississippi has its own Caledonia, Skene, and Inverness. There are many more names, place names across the South that reveal the presence of large numbers of 18th century Irish and even Germanic settlers from Ulster. Over time, their descendants, according to the census data, mostly identify as American only or Irish. Place names, however, are not the only Scotch-Irish contributions to the language of the upland South. The Southern Midlands dialect of America's Southern Hills is world famous when set to music and folk stories. Southern artists and country music have made great use of their culture's words and themes about love, desertion, God, and country, attachment to place and family, and having a great time. Their speech is, according to David Hackett Fischer, the dialect of transcontinental truck drivers, cinematic cowboys, and backcountry politicians. It's spoken in the homes and workplaces of people living in southern Appalachia and the Ozark Mountains, the lower Mississippi Valley, Texas, and the Southern Plains. As Verna Mae Sloan tells in her autobiography, the Southern Midlands dialect has been the source of shame for many people from the South, especially the upland South. Their bold and colorful way of speaking, along with their commitment to Christianity, which the local New Englanders in the 1700s called intolerable and some today would call it deplorable, were instrumental in them not being well received in New England. The flow of Ulster folk then shifted first to Pennsylvania, where they were initially desired as defenders on the frontier. But they found greater opportunities for their brand of living further south and west. Over the years, their speeches served as the oral basis for redneck jokes and the foundation for stereotypical labels such as hillbilly, ridge runner, and hick. Even with these negative labels, though, hill people in the South continue to speak their ancestors' tongue. Robert McNeil claims that the Scots-Irish brought with them a rich, colorful culture that included aphorisms or sayings, proverbs, superstitions, and the ability to turn a striking phrase like mad as a meat axe, dead as a hammer, so drunk he couldn't hit the wall with a handful of beans. Now, that's pretty drunk if you ask me. Cratus Williams, who some consider to be the father of Appalachian studies, programs and universities here in the South, observed that the Appalachian people love stories. Even when they are in a hurry, they'll stop to hear stories. The best stories told in the Appalachian tradition, according to Cratus Williams, are told in the dialect. Now, I want to share with you a sample of the terms used by regional folk today. I confirmed the use of these terms in field studies I conducted among residents of various counties throughout the South. They included Benton, Johnson, and Washington counties in Arkansas, Cherokee County, North Carolina, Anderson, Roane, and Morgan counties in Tennessee, Cherokee County, Georgia, Newton and McDonald counties in Missouri, and Rogers, Delaware, and Ottawa counties in Oklahoma. I also had the opportunity to spend over a year researching Scotland and found more evidence of what I'm about to share with you. You might note that Dixon and Fisher provide additional information that's useful in making a connection between many of the words listed below and those used by early backcountry settlers and their folks in Ireland and the border country of northern Great Britain. I'll provide you with the bibliography upon request. Just write to vantagepoint22@gmail.com. Let's take a look now at Table 1. It's full of all kinds of interesting terms and expressions that I picked up on in those studies. Now, how about fixin' to? That means getting ready to go. How about aimin' to? Well, aimin' to is getting ready to go, but it's a little further down the line. Now, just think about if somebody's trying to get to the restroom and they say, "Get out of my way, I'm fixing to go to the bathroom," or "Get out of my way, I'm aiming to go to the bathroom." Well, one's more urgent, so you might want to get out of the person's way who's got the fixin' to go. Now, let's take a look. Thar. There they are. Where? Over there. Each. I got it. Each. I can't scratch it. Har. That's her har. Can you believe that's her har? She's colored her har again. How about hit? You use hit instead of it if it's stressed. Hankering. Anxious to go, to do something. When I was in Scotland, I was doing research on my dissertation, my PhD thesis, and finishing up another book that I had written. And I had this interesting experience where I was reading an autobiography written by Reverend Robert Blair, I think it was published in 1660, 61, something like that. And in that book, he says, "At the time when I went to Ulster, I still had a hankering to go to France, but the Lord pushed me altogether against my will to Northern Ireland, or to Ulster." So I thought, wow, that's pretty cool, hankering. So there it was. Anyway, let's go on. Critter, you know what a critter is. It's a creature. Haint, and a haint is a ghost, a skift in snow, and you can go on down the line and look at those. If you have any questions about any of them, you're more than welcome to write me about it. I'd be happy to talk to you about those. I think it'd be fun to carry on that dialogue with anybody who's interested. Now, those words and their standard English equivalents illustrate there are differences between the Southern Midlands and standard English dialects. By examining, for example, the words skift and dusting, as well as letting on and pretend, it's easy to see these are different words with the same meaning, which provides evidence of a difference in dialect. The words branch and branch are the same words, but they are spelled differently and sound differently. Let us put our focus on sentence structure. Although double negatives are not always used in Southern Midland speech, they occur frequently, and frequently enough to warrant our attention. Their use provides extra emphasis on a point that the speaker is trying to make. That's important here. It's an emphasis thing. That's why they do it. My young'uns don't have none of them things. Nah, I don't want none of that nanner pudding. And I ain't never seen none of them things. Verbs are also used differently, especially regarding tenses. Consider these examples. Well, I ain't never run into him, Jew. He done finished for the day. She done did it, I saw her. They was there, I seen 'em. Was you born in a barn? This is a direct quote from my cousin Euclid Voiles, who lived in southwestern North Carolina, less than 8 miles from the Tennessee state line, about 15 miles from the Georgia state line. And he said, telling a story, and these people were cracking me up. All my relatives were sitting around. It's one of the last great times I had with my grandparents' generation. And he said, every time I'd hit the ground, Mama would warp me one. These sentences clearly maintain a consistent form and composition that differentiates them from sentences in standard English. Did you notice the emphasis on the getting hit in Cousin Euclid's example? It wasn't it was hit. He was hit the ground. Anyway, The words and expressions presented in this series are not relics of the past. They form important components in a living, breathing culture that has a heritage extending into the past, well beyond the signing of the Declaration of Independence. It has roots that go back to the Roman days in Great Britain, when clergy from the Catholic and Roman Catholic churches introduced biblical words to our ancestors. Scholars have given too much credit, I think, to the Saxons for their role in helping to shape the culture of northern Great Britain. This series, I hope, has shown that the Saxons were a primary force in developing the culture of southern Britain. In the north, the Saxon dialect gave way to the tongue of the Angles, who formed the Kingdom of Northumbria, which once extended from the north side of the English Midlands to Edinburgh, Scotland. Now, though the Kingdom of Northumbria was absorbed into England and Scotland respectively, the dialect was preserved well into the 17th century and the reign of King James, who was the first monarch to rule both Scotland and England and had the first person to have the power to do something about the lawlessness on the border in the border region. King James facilitated the migration of Presbyterians from the Scottish Lowlands, as well as Quakers and Baptists from England. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the arrival of smaller numbers of Protestants from Wales, France, and the Palatinate. If you haven't heard of the Palatinate, it was a historic region in what is today southwestern Germany. You may have picked up on James's interest in recruiting Protestants to settle Ireland and may have wondered why he followed that policy. After all, it's not politically correct today, is it? Nope. To appreciate his moves or motives, we must keep in mind that the idea of separation of church and state is an American notion. King James and his heirs were quite concerned about having staunch Catholic countries off the eastern and western shores that washed their island. When the Stuart dynasty's reign ended in 1714, the financial and political policies used against Roman Catholics in Ireland were then applied to Protestants who, in Ulster, refused to join the Church of Ireland. Why, might you ask? Well, King James famously said once, "No bishop, no king." And he probably said it more than once, but once I know of because I've seen it in writing. He wanted preachers and their bishops, who the monarch had appointed, to show their loyalty to the crown and encourage that among the congregants. The goal of the policies was to coerce both Catholics and other dissenting groups to be under the sway of a monarch-appointed bishop. Beginning in 1717, the first of 5 great waves of Ulster immigrants left for America. As they did with their eager luggage, the immigrants carried their dialect with them from Ulster to Appalachia. In Appalachia, the Ulster Protestants became known as the Scotch-Irish, and their dialect has been labeled Southern Midlands. Folks, before you write to me to tell me that Scotch is an alcoholic drink, you can stop writing. I know that. In the late 1600s, though, the word Scotch was applied to anything that belonged to Scotland, including its people. Do just a bit of thinking, and you'll recognize that it's not limited to alcoholic beverages in its history. In the history of the country, I should say. Have you ever heard of Scotch tape? It comes complete with its tartan logo. How about Scotch pine trees? I lived in the bonny land, but I never saw a pine tree hit the bottle. I'll concede that it's now considered a drink in Scotland, but the Scotch-Irish people no longer live in Scotland and haven't for nearly 400 years. After centuries of time and thousands of miles of diffusion, the natural beauty of their ancient words and sentences pieced together like a grandmother's quilt, reminding folks that life and its circumstances have always been and forever will be here. Well, folks, that's about all I have for you in this series. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you enjoyed it. Until I see you again, may the good Lord bless and keep you. May He make His face shine on you and give you peace. Bye-bye.